People who've gotten their bosses fired. How? He grabbed the back of my neck and said, if you ever say I'm wrong in front of a customer again, I will beat your butt. I went to the GM and told him, and my supervisor was relieved of his duties about 5 minutes later. Oh sweet justice. I took a cell phone video of her taking money from the safe and putting it in her wallet. I knew she was doing it, and I also knew that the moment it came out that money was missing, she'd blame it on me. But she was so stupid that she didn't realize she should stop doing that while I was standing 10 feet away with my phone out and facing her. She knew you were there, and still did it. The CEO publicly praised me for completing a task that my boss had struggled with. So my boss retaliated by forwarding all of his tasks to me in an effort to overwhelm me with work. I actually found his job pretty manageable, which the CEO also noticed and fired him, giving me his job in office. Mayo, MVP is the CEO who actually noticed. Was working maintenance at an ice rink. The rule for anyone who knows how an ice rink works is if the Zamboni doors open, you get the frick off the ice. Some donghead decided to ignore the fact that they were open and that I was standing in the doorway, and decided to rip off one last slap shot. The puck bounced off the glass and hit me in the head. I was okay, but reported it to my boss, because we have to fill out an incident report for things like that. The boss asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I feel okay." Then he responded with, "Well, we don't really have to report it then, do we?" I reminded him of the protocol, but it was clear he didn't want to do it. Since he wouldn't do it, I sent a descriptive email of the incident up to the administration, because I felt there should be some sort of documentation paper trail in case God forbid I ended up having a brain hemorrhage or something a few days later. The boss was fired by my next shift. Because I felt there should be some sort of documentation paper trail in case God forbid I ended up having a brain hemorrhage or something a few days later. Exactly the way to go. You never know, anything needs to be documented. Our desks were separated by a 5-foot cubicle wall. He was under the mistaken impression that it totally blocked sound. Thus I got to hear all his loud phone conversations. Primarily his booty calls, including those with his boss's fiancée. I figured it was none of my business and tried to ignore it. Well, there was a position in another department that I was interested in, and as per procedure I handed in an application to my talkative boss. Didn't hear anything further and followed up a couple of days later, only to be told that something must have happened to the application. Filled out another one and handed it in. As I returned to my desk, I hear the boss on the phone with a friend laughing about how he had just trashed my application again and how he was never going to let go of me. I go to boss's boss and angrily offer my resignation, telling him what I had just overheard, explaining that I was constantly hearing his phone calls like his booty calls, like with woman's name, and woman's name, and boss's fiance's name. He got very quiet and told me to go back to my desk and he'll take care of everything. The next day I come in and boss is gone. The day after, I have an interview with the other department. Got the position. I tend to avoid office drama, but really, he should have stuck to screwing his boss's fiancée and not tried to screw me as well. He got greedy, then got burned. My boss hired me at a surprisingly good salary and got me 2 raises in the first 5 years. When the work slowed down to our department, he defended all his employees to management. They fired him the same day they fired me. In college I worked in a takeout restaurant just off campus, and we were all employed by the school. I was 17-18 years old, back in 2007-2008, and my boss, the manager, was a 40-something creeper, hitting on me, touching me inappropriately, trying to massage my shoulders, tickling me, putting his hands on around my waist, despite me asking him to stop. Then he friended me on Facebook. I declined, and suddenly my work schedule was changed. I was on shift during hours when I had class, and when I explained that problem, I got taken off the schedule altogether. I told the assistant manager what was going on, which I was explicitly told by the manager not to talk to the assistant, and he reported what was going on to upper management. Boom, manager was fired. I worried for a while if he was going to come after me for that. Phoned him to tell him I won't be at work for the rest of the week as my mum is terminally ill in hospital. The next day, about an hour after she passed away, he phoned and asked why I wasn't at work. I just hung up on him so I wouldn't say anything that would get me in trouble. The next day I sent the area manager a WhatsApp message explaining what he'd be done and attached a video of him breaking the freezer door while having a tantrum, which cost the store nearly £5,000 in lost stock and the repair costs, which he'd told the AM it broke on its own. He got fired that day and I got 2 weeks off with full pay. On the bright side, you always know that you were there for her no matter what. I'm sure she would have been very proud of the way you handled that. You were by her side in her final moments, and that's what counts. Even if he was a total jerk afterwards, he can't take that from you. Hugs. Basically said I'm quitting because of X. Boss looked at me and said, can I convince you to delay this by a week? Worked from home for a week. Then she, X, was gone. Worked there for 5 more years, then 7 at the company that acquired us. About 13-14 years ago, I was working as a web designer for a .com. In our immediate group were a creative director, a creative manager, and 2 of us who were designers, and we were all part of the marketing department. The creative director was a joke, brought in by the previous VP of marketing who he was friends with. He hardly did any work himself, and just played online poker waiting on us to send him things for approval. And he'd never stick around late when the rest of us needed to stay late to hit a deadline or deal with a crisis, etc. The creative manager, who'd been in charge for a couple years before the creative director's hiring, still ran the day-to-day, so the creative manager gave his notice that he'd accepted a new job, and when I met with the current VP of marketing to discuss transition, I mentioned that the creative director would need to step up and pull his weight. I guess a similar message was expressed by a number of people, and less than a week after the creative manager's last day, the creative director was fired. This kind of sucked because we went down from 4 to 2 people in our group. I was appointed acting creative manager, and we eventually did hire 1 more designer. I left the company a couple months later, too, after the latest VP of marketing was let go and there was going to be a 10th different person overseeing marketing in my 5 years there. And the butthole creative director, he'd reached out at some point, looking for files for his portfolio, I think, and it happened to be in the 2-week window where I'd accepted my next job but hadn't yet started, so I mentioned my new position. Well, he fires off a copy of his resume to the company president and tried to poach my new job out from under me. On my first day at the new job, the president mentioned that somebody else from that same company also applied for the job and forwarded me the application email to see if I knew him. Saw that the date was after he and I had last communicated. As a matter of fact, yes, I do know him. He's a big part of the reason I'm applying here. I was fired because I abandoned my job while on short-term disability, because while on approved leave, they are a date for me to return, never informed me, by their own admission, and when I obviously didn't return to work, I was fired. The locker I had at work had my work boots in it that the company pays $90 a year towards. However, there isn't a pair under $100 available, so you always end up having some come out of your paycheck. At that point they are yours regardless of the company line. They disagreed and said they were thrown out. I reported them stolen, and the HR director responsible for getting me fired was fired. You hoisted someone else by your bootstraps. My manager wanted to prove I'm slacking off so he could write me up. So he watched CCTV footages, then wrote, printed out and signed a detailed 17 pages worth of Word document. What did I do in the past 2 days? With timestamps, like 7:59 arriving, 8:01 speaking with coworker A and B, 8:07 sitting down to my desk, etc. He told me that he's not happy with my work ethics if I won't improve my efficiency. I'm for it. I took the papers and showed to his boss and told her that I'm not happy with my manager's work ethics and his efficiency might be better if he wouldn't watch 17 hours of CCTV footages to spy on an employee. She was terrified. It would have been a rock solid lawsuit for me, but I love my job, and we had to search for a new manager. Also, my salary raised. The good all know you. I've told this story a few times before, so I'll keep it short. I didn't get my boss fired, but she blames me. Boss and I didn't get along, but she didn't have the authority to fire me. But she promised her boyfriend my job, so she hires her boyfriend in another position, with the plan they'll drive me to quit, and then she can just promote him to my job. This lasted for about a month. She fired him when they broke up. He confessed their scheme to me on his way out. We'd actually become friends at this point, and I tell him he should really tell HR. HR does their investigation. She's fired because sleep with me and I'll give you a job is textbook sexual harassment. And she tells anyone who'll listen that it's all my fault because I didn't quit like I was supposed to. And I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for this meddling employee who didn't quit when I bullied him. Worst Scooby-Doo villain ever. One summer I volunteered to help a conservation society in East Africa. The aim of the project was to educate the local rural population about poaching and to get them to help us stop it from the ground up. Anyway, I was staying with the lead ranger and his family, and on numerous occasions he served us meat that I'm 100% sure was poached. He tried to tell me that it was pork, but it was dark and gamey with lots of small bones. I think that it was small antelope like dik or diker. When I returned to Nairobi I mentioned to my grandpa, his boss's boss, that we'd eaten some odd meals. He investigated and found out that my boss had a poacher friend who was selling him illegal meat. He was fired. I didn't feel guilty. Poaching is awful. Hate to tell you, he most likely became a poacher. I left my last company due to a bully overgrams. Many people were leaving over him, causing problems, being sexist, racist, doing things people could easily sue them for, claiming sexual harassment. List goes on. Everyone informed HR during their exit interviews. Heck, he even tried to make my exit interview not happen, though they still weren't doing anything. I had been at my new job for a couple months now and was still getting complaints from my old team almost daily. So I made an email account and named concerned company name crew. Sent an email to everyone who had an email account within the company explaining what he still did with events spanning from his start to the day prior. They fired him within the week and my old crew thanked me. Thanks for doing that. I took a phone call on my cell when at my desk. Middle manager came up and screamed at me, yelling about how I was not allowed to take calls for clients while at that office. I was a contractor and made it perfectly clear that I did work for multiple clients prior to doing work for this company. The CTO's office was 10 feet from mine. He came out and stood in his doorway listening to the rant. When the middle manager was done I just looked over at the CTO and said, it's a mommy and at the moment I don't give a frick which you pick. CTO walked the middle manager out right then. Funny thing, I didn't hang up throughout the incident, and it was my wife on the other end. I was spending about 70 hours a week at their site digging their staff out of a hole they had dug themselves in. It's him or me and at the moment I don't give a frick which you pick. Grass on your mountainous brass balls. Not my boss, but I helped my friend get her boss fired. He was a general manager and always grabbing her sides, purposely scheduling her to have shifts alone with him, asking her for nudes, asking her to sleep with him, etc. She reported it so many times to the owner, big boss, and they said they couldn't do anything because they hadn't seen it and had no other reports other than her account. So I called and complained as a customer about how I witnessed him being creepy to her and how it made me uncomfortable. For the most part true, lol. I just don't shop there. That's kinda scary. Would be nice if the company didn't encourage that. Not me, but my GF at the time. We were both working at a small burrito chain. She was front of house manager and I was kitchen manager. Above us was one senior manager and then the owner. We did tip pooling based on hours, and the senior manager always told my GF not to count the tips every night, as he divided it up at the end of the week. Well, of course she counted them every night. Turns out the senior manager was stealing almost $500 a week from employees in tips, and because his previous farm manager never questioned him, it had likely been going on for years. She told the owners and he was gone the next day. A week later his wife left him. Stealing from your boss is wrong. Stealing from your employees is just straight evil. Complained for months about her breaking company policy, and thus state labor law, since the state considered a signed employee handbook to be a binding contract for both sides. Nothing. Tricked her into saying the things I'd been complaining about for months on a conference call with her boss and her boss's boss. Fired that day. Context. My boss tried to tell me I couldn't take breaks. The company policy handbook, which I had signed and thus became a binding contract by state law, laid out lunch and or breaks based on length of shift scheduled for. When I pointed this out, she switched to scheduling me by myself and then strolling by the store to check up on me occasionally, writing me up when she caught me having closed the store in order to take breaks, eat lunch, called her boss, regional director, and complained, got the write-ups removed, listened to her tell my boss to chill the frick out and let me take my breaks. She still didn't do it. Further, formal complaints resulted in no changes. I knew there was a quarterly conference call coming up, so I developed the habit of walking into her office and saying, "It's time for my break," and making her say, every time, that I wasn't allowed to go. She got in the habit of doing it kind of absent-mindedly in an increasingly aggressive tone. So then I did it again in the middle of the conference call and she blew a gasket, ranting at me about how many times she'd told me that I was not allowed to take breaks, under any circumstances, etc. The call, which she always put on speakerphone, went dead silent. It took her about 5 seconds to realize what she'd just done, and then before she could try to begin damage control, her boss politely cleared her throat and said, "Boss, I've told you before that that is incorrect." I grinned a big ol' crap, eating grin, and went back to work, and there was a temporary manager from another store there the next day. Turns out she had had my formal, written complaints intercepted before they got to her boss, which I wasn't aware was possible. Apparently she had friends in high places, so I imagine that didn't go well for her. I know this comment might be buried, but this was dope. Paranoid, sociopath boss wiretapped all internal phone calls and made life miserable for all who worked in that department. After moving over 1,200 miles to the job location, called wife frequently to discuss the job and family progress in moving there. During those calls, I spun a story about how all of his top managers were plotting against him, which enraged him and he took out his anger on them. Eventually they went to the company owner and complained, and he was fired the next day. I kept a detailed log of both of our times in and out of the office, as well as a detailed list of my work efforts. When I was called into HR to be fired, I produced the logs. I was given their position at the request of a former manager after HR fired my boss. Sire. Public agency hires someone out of private industry at the vice president level. She immediately begins hiring all her cronies and butt kissers from her old job at very nice salaries for jobs that didn't previously exist. That's the sort of corruption we're used to in North Carolina, so no biggie so far. But she runs out of slots she can just create with a little paperwork, so she starts to bully people in order to get them to quit so she can fill their jobs with her friends. One job was that of executive assistant, and she was pretty harsh on the woman who had that job. I witnessed some of this and told the assistant to take it to HR, which she did, and HR just told her to document everything. So she did, and one day the VP caught her recording a yell fest on her phone. The VP wanted to know what was up, so the exec assistant told her that HR wanted documentation and that I had told her how to record conversations on a cell phone, which was legal, BTW. I checked. So she yells at the exec assistant, yells at me, and then gets on the phone to HR, yelling at them that they were a bunch of incompetent fools and that she wanted to know what kind of Mickey Mouse outfit she was working for if she couldn't fire whoever the frick she wanted to fire. Now, we all know there are 3 TRVTHS in life. 1. No tugging on Superman's cape. 2. No land wars in Asia. 3. Don't pee off HR. Sure enough, HR initiates an investigation that took 300 hours of interviews with everyone in the department and a board of inquiry headed up by a senior VP. She was called to the senior VP's office at 4:30 in the afternoon, and when we came to work at 8 the next morning, her office was cleared out. Most of the cronies she hired were gone with a couple of months. No one wanted to work with them, so with no projects on their docket, they knew the writing was on the wall. When the last of the cronies left, her job was eliminated and her staff transferred elsewhere. It was like the evil VP and her mob never existed. He was presenting a PowerPoint that I had put together to all the managers in the building. There was something he wanted to add at the last minute that he had never told me about, and when it wasn't there, he verbally abused me for like 5 minutes straight, yelling, name calling, telling me to prove to him that I had a college degree and wasn't just making it up. I was a contractor, so I was afraid to complain to HR because I assumed they'd just fire me, but a lot of other people in the room did. After the meeting, I went into the shared drive folder to find the presentation notes where the extra information was supposedly located. I watched the last time change from a day ago to the current time. Then he immediately called and said it was right there in the notes file. He was fired the next day for unprofessional behavior. He'd show up every day and tell us a tale of his sexual exploits. Whether true or not, none of us wanted to hear it. If an attractive looking female comes in, he drops what he's doing and stares at her, drooling like a dog in a dog treat factory. After she leaves, he had to say a comment about her appearance. After talking on the phone with a certain manager, he always comments on how nice her butt is. He'd bully us employees and other managers, called us B a lot despite us getting onto him for it. My female co-worker reported him. We all had a phone meeting with our district manager and HR. He was suspended until the investigation was over and they ruled to terminate him. Surprisingly, HR worked for us that day. Still worked for the company. Sounds like he was a lawsuit waiting to happen. It was the night shift and for years this freaking guy had been either locking himself in the office and playing video games all night, or going home and freaking sleeping on the clock, and no, I'm not making that up. Finally one night the regional manager showed up for a surprise visit at like 3 AM. It was a group effort. The night crew took great pleasure in telling the RM exactly where his night manager was. First rule of good management is showing up on the off shifts. Trust, but verify. My direct supervisor, Linda, was a cantankerous older woman with poor education and even worse people skills. About 3 months after I started, I got her so pissed off, just by doing my job, that she cursed me out, got up from her desk and quit. I don't even remember what I said that set her off. I probably asked her if she was done with her half of something that I needed in order to finish my half, and became exasperated when she wasn't, because she'd been farting around all morning. It was a common occurrence. After Linda walked out, our boss refused to hire her back when she begged, even though she'd been there something like 15 years, because her attitude was so terrible and she'd become such a toxic, pathetic excuse for a human being. I got a pretty solid raise. Most of Linda's tasks, our boss was not unkind and took over some things herself, while giving me more practical things that I enjoyed doing. And even though my car was fine, she'd always have me drive her car to go make coffee runs, deposit checks, run errands, etc. It was a Toyota Solara convertible, and she'd tell me to take the top down and have fun. I liked that job. I learned quite a bit, and if I hadn't found something closer to home, for even more money, I probably would have been there quite a while. Glad to see your boss taking care of you, although she was probably using you driving the car as a tax write-off car used for work purposes. I found out she was inflating our numbers to make it look like we were hitting our daily and weekly goals by not turning in everyone's timesheets and covering the pay with petty cash. It all came crashing down on her when a bunch of people in our office didn't get their checks and she didn't have enough cash left to cover them. I called the regional manager, her boss, that night and she was fired the next day. His boss asked me to keep tabs on him. He was working a fraction of his hours, salaried, calling an hourly guy so he could leave early, not doing work while he was there, etc. Not fired but demoted. I got fired and explained in my exit interview how the reason I wasn't making progress on my project is that I had no idea what I was doing. I was never trained. My WFH boss in another location took off for 4 hours a day to run errands and go to the gym, etc. etc. They checked my story out and ended up demoting my boss, taking her off the project, and taking away all her direct reports. I didn't technically get her fired, but when she refused to hire me full-time after 3 months on temporary like promised, I just said it wasn't worth it, quit, and a week later about 30 people followed because they were getting similarly screwed. So they got rid of all of the management and transferred in new managers. Worked at a McDonald's in high school at 17. I was being sexually harassed by a co-worker twice my age. He said some really awful stuff to me that made me afraid to come to work. They refused to switch my shifts. They also were working me too much for being under 18 and tried to get me to sign a consent form saying I knew I'd be working the hours I was, when I constantly asked for different hours. I called the corporate offices and told them. My parents even got a lawyer involved. I quit, and a few weeks later a co-worker I went to school with said 2 of the shift managers, the supervisor, and the store manager were all terminated and barred from working with the company again. They brought in a few temporary people who were high up and ended up sniffing out the other bad employees. He was such a bullshitter. All talk. He yells at me one day for failing to do some task, which got done anyway because someone got a hold of my boss. They only needed a mailing address I forgot to give them. Meanwhile, he's over at his buddy's house looking at his new boat. Pee me off, so I called his boss and told him all the work that gets done out of this office is me. 'Twas a long talk with him, but Big Boss said he had a feeling that was what was going on. This obviously wasn't the first time my boss was slacking off, but him giving me crap when he wasn't even in the office was the camelback straw. Boss didn't get fired, but left shortly after. Was an awkward couple of weeks. Big Boss ended up writing me a nice recommendation letter when I changed positions. Oh boy, my time to shine. I used to work for an industrial supply company and my boss was undiagnosed, but admittedly bipolar. He was extremely mean and would be very Jackal and Hyde-like. He used to threaten us, would call our spouses and yell at them about our performance, berate us in front of customers. The list goes on. He once told me that if my 5-year plan wasn't helping get him promoted, then I had no place in the company. He openly questioned me as a person, my relationship, and my personal morals since I didn't want to sell faulty equipment. I would have many panic attacks before work, and after 3 years I decided that enough was enough. From the very first occurrence I began documenting everything. When he smashed a candy machine, I took photos. Brought and kept his gun at work, I took photos. Berated a co-worker's spouse, I called and got signed copies of the transcription. I basically documented everything so that no one could tell me this wasn't happening, and had substantial proof of this hostile work environment. One day I called our district manager out to lunch. I put the several-inch thick manila folder in front of him and informed him that either he fired and replaced our boss or everyone was walking out. Given the evidence and after speaking with the other employees, our boss, 10 years in the company, was fired. I have never been more satisfied and proud of myself in my life. Not to make light of the situation, but call my spouse and berate her for my performance. See how that goes for you, lol. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.